In March this year, Silicon Valley Bank, an American bank, faced a large collapse. This was largely the case because its investments were centered in the technological sector, which had similar risk profiles and returns. And when those returns didn't meet standards, a lot of creditors started taking their money out of Silicon Valley Bank at a much faster rate than the bank had anticipated. As a result, the bank lost a lot of liquidity and couldn't pay back some of its creditors after a while, and the bank was eventually forced to close. The flow-on effects of international markets meant that this hit one bank, Credit Suisse, a Swiss bank, very badly, and as a result, it was also looking likely that Credit Suisse would default on some of its creditors and potentially collapse. So, in an attempt to prevent this collapse, the other Swiss bank, UBS, bought Credit Suisse out at a fraction of its retail value, with support from the Swiss National Bank. So this bailout's a little bit different to ones you may have heard of in the past. In this case, one bank bought out another with the support of the government national bank at its core. Key supporters of this bailout say it was incredibly valuable because it prevented the entire market collapsing. The reason for this is that had Credit Suisse been allowed to collapse entirely, market confidence would have reduced, which means that a lot of other people and other banks, not just in Switzerland but across Europe and the world, would have begun drawing out their money from the banks, concerning that their bank too may collapse. And as an inevitable result, when people start drawing out their money, the banks lose liquidity and eventually do face collapse as a result. So in this case, this co-bank bailout was useful in supporting market confidence and preventing it having flow-on effects. The other benefit of this is that it changed the corporate structure of Credit Suisse. A lot of people think that Credit Suisse was more likely to fail than other banks within Switzerland, such as UBS itself, because it had been facing a lot of trouble in the past, and some of its corporate management wasn't living quite up to standards. Allowing UBS to take it over meant that it was forced to reconsider its corporate structure, change people at the top and throughout its management levels, and perhaps put it on a more positive outlook moving forward. So the concerns around this bailout, alike to bailouts in the past, are that people are unsure if the government and the central bank should be propping up banks that aren't operating perfectly, and if it's the case that they're running questionable lending or crediting practices, it might be best for them to collapse to allow the market to only have secure and responsible banks moving forward. But in this case, it's a little bit different, and there are additional concerns here. Mainly, that allowing the biggest bank in Switzerland, UBS, to take over its biggest rival, Credit Suisse, actually would lead to less competition in the banking sector, not just within Switzerland, but also with all consumers who use those banks moving forward. That may mean they're more likely to turn to less favourable lending practices because they know they captivate and hold more of the market in their own control. Additionally, there are some concerns about the consolidation of risk, which is to say if you have lots of different banks that put their investments in different places, even if one falls or faces struggle, it doesn't necessarily mean that the others are likely to have the same result. But in this case, if you have one big bank that owns a lot of these assets and a lot of these investments, if it begins to have trouble at one end of the company, it's more likely to infect all of their creditors and all of the people that necessarily bank with them. So in that case, it's kind of creating one super bank that if it faces issues or also faces collapse, then it's likely to affect a far bigger proportion of the market than would have had happened otherwise. It isn't too difficult to understand why the Swiss National Bank decided to support UBS in buying Credit Suisse out. We only have to look back 10 or 15 years at the GFC to understand the drastic effects that allowing banks to collapse can have on every member of an economy across the world. But this wasn't the only option that was available in Switzerland. They could have done a complete government bailout of a bank, such as what happened to multiple banks after the GFC, or they could have done what they did in America for Silicon Valley Bank itself. That's what they term making deposits whole, which essentially is where the government secures each depositor's money within a bank. So if there is a collapse, the government promises to pay all those individuals out all of their money, or at least part of it. And some people think that would be a better way to secure the funding prospects within these banks but also to prevent propping up banks that perhaps aren't the most sustainable in the future. Either way that you look at it, it's clear that something has to be done, and there might be pros and cons to every circumstance, and there probably isn't your perfect one.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.